Not Scott.
Why not?
Because I'm not. I'm not Scott. Scott is preaching. He was asked to come preach at J this morning, so Josh is going to. He needs to practice. Josh is in India, I believe, on a mission trip. Yeah. And so he asked a couple of weeks ago if Scott could come up there and preach, which would be great exposure for him, and because they supported Andrea and myself when we were in Paraguay. And then he asked if I would fill in this morning, which obviously easy to do, no problem to do. So that's why I'm just going to step in just for this one Sunday, and then he'll be back next Sunday to continue missions class. And so you can guess what I'm going to continue with. The class that I was teaching whenever he came in. So we're going to continue, but we're going to have a special focus this morning. So we are studying the life of Christ. And if you've been a part of this class for the last year and a half, you know that we've been advancing through the chronological accounts of the gospel, account of Jesus Christ in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Take all four of those gospels and proceed through these various events. And we're now to the point of the Gospels. So we're going to, the parables. We're going to be today looking at an introduction to the parables because we have many parables that we're going to be studying when we return to this class, which will be sometime in late January, February, I believe it is, whenever Scott's going to be ready to finally, they're going to be transitioning going to Italy to start their work there, and at that time I'll just step back in and continue this class. So I want to try to do an introductory class this morning on the parables, maybe some things that you did not realize to help us in understanding and studying the parables. And so where we're at is, as I mentioned, in these chronological accounts of these events that we follow. We just arbitrarily took the events. If you look at all the various events, there's different number of events in the life of Christ. Put a number to it. And then you'll see that sometimes that particular event will be in more than one of the gospel accounts. For example, the first one there, when we just discussed in our last time we were in class, was Jesus' true family. And you see that was in chapter 12 to the end of chapter 12. It was also in Mark chapter 3 and Luke chapter 8. And then the very next thing that you see is the parable of the sower. And from that point, we start going forward in the chronology through these parables that Jesus teaches. And that's what I want to talk about today and explain a little bit more in detail these parables. Now, I know you can't read that, but that's just an overall timeline. If you were to take Jesus' life and just put it on a line, what you have, if you zoom in here, is you have right here the birth of Jesus, and then you move up 12 years, whenever he's young and in the temple there, and his parents went to try to find him in the temple. And then you continue for several more years till you get into whenever he's about 30 years old. And he starts his ministry in these 4 years right here of his ministry. And you can break those down into 4 different sections, 4 different years of that ministry. And we are, again, I know you can't probably read that very well, but this right here says Jesus teaches the kingdom parables. So over here you had John the Baptist appears in the wilderness, moving on down to Jesus, different things that he did till you get to this point where he chooses the 12, and then you get into Jesus teaches the disciples. So this just gives you a visual of where we are. We still have a whole lot more, obviously, to cover. With the majority of the gospel accounts in the Passion of Christ, that last week of Christ. That's where the majority of the time will be spent, and we'll get into more detail. And it's whenever you get into that most important event in Jesus' life that you start to see really where these gospel accounts, these different accounts come into play because they give different details. And some people have used those details to try to say that the Bible is contradicting itself, and in fact it's not. It's actually supplementing itself in each one of those details, which we'll get to when we get to that point. So just to make it a little bit more simple as far as the timeline of Jesus' life, basically what the writers do is break it down into the times of the Passover. And so it'll Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John will say, for example, John 2, verse 13 says, "And the time of the Passover." Well, this is the first time we see that in that account of John. And then he tells all the different things that Jesus did, as well as the other three. And then you get into the second Passover, the third Passover, and then finally the last Passover, the fourth one, which is where Jesus is crucified. And it's in between these that you have these other major events that take place, like the Sermon on the Mount and things like that. So we are right about here when you get to the parables. John, the baptizer, had just sent his disciples to Jesus to ask if he is indeed the Messiah. And then you move into the account of his family and the attacks of the Pharisees. And then you get into the parables. And that's why I say we're right about here. So that's why we're going to look at today. If you want to open your Bibles to Matthew chapter 13, let's look there first. And then we'll go into Mark and then also into Luke. So in Matthew chapter 13, as I mentioned, this is after, in chapter 12, this is the last chapter that we finished when we were in this class. And now we move into chapter 13, and it says, "On the same day." So a continuation of what Jesus has already done. And as I just mentioned, this is where his family has come to him. This is whenever he was healing people and had all kinds of different things. It's already been a very busy day for Jesus. And now it says, on that same day, Jesus went out of the house and sat by the sea. And a great multitude were gathered together to him, so that he got into a boat and sat, and the whole multitude sat on the shore. Then he spoke many things to them in parables. And that's the point we want to emphasize right now before we actually get into the parable. This is a marked change in Jesus' teaching. Now, it's not the first time he uses a parable to teach, but from this point on, he really starts emphasizing these parables. And so it's important for us to understand why Jesus uses parables. What is a parable? How do the parables work? How do we interpret parables so that we can understand exactly what it is Jesus is teaching? Now turn with me to Mark chapter 4. And this is the reason we do this study, is it helps us understand a few more details by looking at the parallel account. If you have one of those Bibles that's a chronological Bible, what it'll do is it'll take Matthew chapter 13, 1 through 3, and then the very next thing it'll put in there Mark chapter 4, right here, verses 1 and 2, just so you can see them, right? It puts them all together so that you can see them all together as it moves through. So here, notice just a little bit more detail. "And again he began to teach by the sea, and a great multitude was gathered to him, so that he got into a boat and sat in it on the sea. The whole multitude was on the land facing the sea. Then he taught them many things by parables, and said to them in his teaching." All right, let's look in one more in Luke chapter. Let me get my notes here right. All right, in Luke chapter 5. And you just see a little bit more information here. Luke chapter 5, verses 1 through 3. Now, we've actually already covered this, but it gives us information, and also shows us this is not the first time Jesus uses a boat to teach in. "And so it was, as the multitude pressed about him to hear the word of God, that he stood by the lake of Gennesaret." That's Lake Galilee, just a different name for it. "And saw two boats standing by the lake, but the fishermen had gone from them and were washing their nets. Then he got into one of the boats, which was Simon's, and asked him to put out a little bit from the land. And he sat down and taught the multitudes from the boat." All right? So this is important to understand right off the bat, this idea of Jesus getting into a boat. You know, many times we read over, I like that term that's been used several times, is we overread the Bible. and that we just read right over that. We don't realize the impact of that. And the reason that's important is because, what does it say? It says the multitudes gathered around Jesus, and he went out in this boat to teach the multitudes. Now, we know from a couple of different accounts how many people were in these multitudes. Remember the stories of the account of Jesus feeding? How many? What was that? 5,000, 2,000. Right down to the number. Wow, that's good, Joey. We have a 5,000 and a 4,000, right? So, how many people do we have in Margaret Street? Whenever this place is packed, about how many people do we have in here? 300, actually. We can get 300 in here when it's packed, okay? Now, typically we have about 200, that's right. So upstairs and downstairs. Let me ask you a question. So if we stand up front with 300 people in here and there's no microphone, how well do you hear? Not very well, especially if you're way back up there. So we have to have somebody like Casey who can really shout, right? Or even Scott has another one of those large voices. I was not blessed. I have a large voice, but I don't use it like that. And so it makes me think, back in the time of the pioneers, the pioneer preachers, there was this, talking about the time of Alexander Campbell and Barton Stone, all them, there was a preacher by the name of Raccoon John Smith. And he was known for having one of those big voices. And he stood up on a stump in, what's the name of that, the Cane Ridge area, and preached a sermon. I think they said there were over 5,000 people there. This is out in the woods with no microphone. That's a loud voice. Now, you have 5, 7, 10,000 people somewhere beside this lake. How do people hear you? Well, this is an interesting piece of archaeology or evidence that the Bible, it shows some proof of the Bible. And that is this place called the Cove of the Sower. If you look at the Lake Galilee, up in the northwest corner, there's this one little cove that's right on the shoreline of the lake. And it just so happens that in that cove, there is an area that looks kind of like an amphitheater. And so I don't know if any of you have ever been on a lake, been on the water, or been across a pond, perhaps. If you've ever been, some of us might have been fishing. Now, somebody will be standing all the way on the other side of the pond. And you're over here on this side, and they may not be talking very loud, but you can hear every word they say. It's an acoustic phenomenon that takes place because of that hard surface of the water, that the sound waves carry right across it without being absorbed, like grass or trees or something like that. Jesus uses this to his advantage by getting in this boat, getting offshore, so that his voice now is going to be amplified. And as you see in the pictures here, this cove right here is basically the shape of an amphitheater. Now, if you've ever been in a natural amphitheater, this is the way the Greeks built those, in this cone shape, so that somebody standing down in the front, looking up in this cone, they can use the natural acoustics to reach the farthest seats. And so here we have a natural spot in the lake where Jesus was able to do that. Now, it's interesting. They did some acoustical studies of this cove back in 1976, and it was concluded that you could get between 5,000 to 7,000 people in this spot right here. And then even double that if you go all the way back up here. Now, I was looking online, and it showed this gentleman standing all the way back up here about where this tree is. And there was another little tree right down here on the shoreline. And this guy was down it was quite a distance. And he was speaking in a normal voice, and they had a recording, and you could hear everything that man was saying. It was rather, and you could even hear the cars going by in front and everything, but still hear that man way down on the front there. So it's interesting whenever you see something like this Cove of the Sower, because oftentimes we'll see a picture, perhaps something like that, which is still accurate, but we don't realize the impact of that how could Jesus teach 5, 7, 10,000 people at one time unless he had an incredible voice, which I'm sure he probably did. And don't forget, this is the Son of God. So interesting, just that information. Now, we get into the word parable itself. To fully appreciate and understand the parables of Jesus, we need to consider the nature of the parables, how significant they are to Jesus' teaching, and how to interpret them, as we mentioned. And so we have the word itself, parable. The word parable, it comes from the Greek word parabole, and it's where it means to place beside, to throw alongside, to compare together. Now, we get our word para from that. It's a Greek transliteration, and we have the words like paralegal. And para means alongside. So paralegal is alongside legal, paramedical, paraglider. All the para words that we have means alongside. And then the word bole or balo means a placing or a throwing. And so you place it or put it beside. So we make a physical placing of something in order to result in a spiritual application, or, better said, using earthly, physical objects in order to explain heavenly and spiritual concepts. That's what Jesus is doing, and we're going to talk about why that works so well. And so, that's what a parable is. Now, Jesus used what's known as this idea of laying aside, of being able to see stuff so that people could understand, and many times they believe that he could just point right to the very object he was talking about. You think about the sower, the seed and the sower that we're about to look at, or that's about to be spoken about in chapter 13 of Matthew. He could have looked right there where the people were standing. You remember that cove that I showed you? You remember, if I back up here, you'll notice that it's agriculture right there. Look at all the agriculture right there around him. So all he would have had to have done is point and say, some of the seed fell on the pathway. There have been people standing right there on the pathway. He could have pointed and said, some of the seed fell in the stony ground. Was there stony ground there? Absolutely. Some of the seed fell where there are thorns. He could have pointed to the thorns. And then some of the seed could have fell on fertile ground. That's pretty powerful, isn't it, to be able to do that? Imagine all of the different things that Jesus could have pointed to. You remember whenever he was walking back into Jerusalem, and there was the olive tree, and he went up to the olive tree and cursed the olive tree, and then he used that as a parable. He would do the same thing with all the different things that we see. For example, the nets. Whenever he talks about the kingdom of heaven is like he just turn around and say a fishing net. Or he could turn around and say that are like lost sheep. Or that I am the vine and you are part of the vineyard. And he might even be standing in a vineyard. And so it's amazing that Jesus could use these earthly, physical things to explain heavenly concepts. Now, an interesting thing that Jesus did is this was not an unusual form of teaching. The rabbis, and Jesus is considered a rabbi in his day and age, the rabbis used what's called stock metaphors. In other words, these metaphors, like masters and fathers and kings, almost always are representative of God. That God is who that is supposed to be. The servants and the children that's representative of the servants of God. As well as a harvest means judgment, and feast is for those who are gathered in of the saved. And so Jesus takes these, but yet he uses radically different concepts. He's taking it much further into this spiritual realm and used them to reveal and to conceal. Now, there's an interesting thing when you look at just the classifications of parables. There are many parables of different concepts. And if you look at the concepts themselves, it helps us gain a better understanding of some of these parables. For example, there's a large group called the kingdom parables. The sower and the seed is about the kingdom. And he even says that, what shall I liken the kingdom of heaven to? And then he'll tell a parable, and it'll be the mustard seed, the leaven, the different things that he uses, the pearl of great price, the dragnet, and even some of these other ones that he uses, like the two sons, the wicked husbandman. All of these have to do with the kingdom. Now, what's interesting is that there are people today in the church who still do not fully understand or have the kingdom concept. Now, don't fully understand what the kingdom, when I say, do you understand the kingdom concept, most Christians will go, mm-hmm, and then you start pressing them on, well, what does it mean? What is that? How does that apply to us? And they start realizing, okay, maybe I don't. This was evidence just in our church plant. In the church plant we did with Avalon, we saw this idea that of some people grasping the idea of the kingdom concept and some not. And that's not to fault anybody. We're all in different levels of spirituality and understanding. But it helps, I think, now that we've done it and it's been done and people have seen what happens. Do you have a little bit clearer understanding of the kingdom now and what the kingdom is and how it's more important? And so those are the type of things that are difficult for us to understand. Imagine 2,000 years ago, whenever they didn't have any idea what he's talking about. They thought he was talking about a physical kingdom with a military leader, and yet he's trying to help them understand, no. I'm talking about spiritual things here, a spiritual kingdom. That's a pretty large concept to grasp, and these parables help explain it by taking earthly concepts, earthly things, and helping us understand heavenly concepts. They also can divide these into what's called the stewardship parables. That's where we are to be administrators and to take care of certain things. The talents, the pounds, the rich fool. There's the service parables and the preparation parables. In other words, you need to be prepared for that judgment day. And that's how you can classify them in that manner as well. Another way you can do it is by looking at what's called the parable chapters. Now, this is not the only place that parables are found, but there's a high grouping of them, a high concentration of them in these chapters. Matthew chapter 13, as we're about to get into, has a high concentration of them, as well as Matthew chapter 25 and Mark chapter 4. And you can see that some of these are overlapping. So if I go back to Matthew 13, you'll see the sower there, as well as you see it in Mark chapter 4. And also in Luke chapter 15, which is also known as the parable chapter. Once again, that's not the only place that you see the parables of Jesus, but this is where you see this concentration, where in the Sermon on the Mount, for example, he talked about all kinds of different things, mainly about bringing over those old laws or explaining the heart of the law, whereas now in his sermons, he uses a lot more parables, trying to help people understand these concepts, these heavenly, spiritual concepts. And so that's where they're mostly concentrated. Now, another little interesting tidbit, as I was doing this study on this, we have lots of songs based on the parables. I did not realize how many of our songs, and this is just a small list, of how many of our songs are based on the parables. For example, all things are ready, come to the feast. Well, that's based in Matthew chapter 22, and he's talking about that wedding feast and inviting those in. Or obviously some of the other ones that's pretty easy to recognize, like bringing in the sheaves. Well, that goes along with Matthew chapter 9, when he's talking about the laborers are few, but the fields are wide under harvest. Or even, I am the vine, that song that we sing, that's clearly from John chapter 15. And so we see a lot of the songs that we sing, a lot of the songs we sing are from Psalms, the book of Psalms, some of them directly, some of them are from phrases and different verses in the Bible, as well as these parables. I remember whenever I was still very young in the faith, if you will, I was older but young in the faith, and I remember when I had the epiphany, it's like I was reading the Bible, and all of a sudden I start reading these words that are just like a song that we sing, like I will enter in through his gates with thanksgiving in my heart. And I remember going to one of the elders where I was at the time and going, did you know that we sing what's stuff in the Bible? And he just looked at me like, really? Yes, Troy, we do sing what's in the Bible. We can also use, by the way, while I'm on that point, we can also use those things to pray. What those words are there for. I kind of did a little bit of that in Upkeep, where you can take these psalms and use those in your own prayers. Jesus Matthew chapter 6 teaches us how to pray. Shouldn't we use those words? And if we're going to say a prayer, there's nothing wrong with that's why he taught us. Father, that art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread. Forgive us our trespasses. That's a prayer that we are certainly supposed to, able to, and can use. All right, so we have these songs that we sing. Now let's get into the nature of parables, because this is what's really important to understand when it comes to studying this part of the Scriptures. First and foremost, the first point that comes to my mind is these are not children's stories. They're not fables. They are not rhymes. They are not riddles, which fables are unique stories. Riddles, obviously, are to confuse and to puzzle. Fables are more just kind of, they have a moral to the story, but it's not usually a spiritual thing. Okay, these are completely different. Parables are intended to communicate very directly. They're intended to communicate through narrative form. He's telling a story, and we're going to get into the details of that in just a minute, but he's telling a story that is designed to communicate directly to your heart. The second point is, a true parable has a story or a plot to it. There will always be able to identify directly what the story or the plot is. And in this case, it's going to have a beginning and an ending in a true parable. The sower, the mustard seed, the leaven, those, when you think about those, when it's just one verse, how shall I liken heaven? It's like leaven, or it's like a mustard seed. You think, well, that doesn't have a beginning and an end. That's just one little verse. Well, that's more what's called a similitude. Okay? Did I say that right? I struggle with that word. Got too many I's in it. Thank you. Very good. Similitudes, which is basically a comparison, where he's, it's like cinnamon and all those words. It's a comparison, or where you're showing a resemblance, or something of that nature. So you're simply, it's parallelism, so that you can help somebody understand. And we do that as well. When I was learning audio video, I'm not a physicist. I don't know physics. I understand it, but I didn't study it. Or my boss, he had a PhD in physics. So if you explain all these different sine waves and all this calculus and everything else to him, he would get it and understand exactly what this piece of this electronics did. Well, I didn't, and so I went to this class, and they were explaining it, and I just didn't get it. So I walked up to the teacher, and I said, I'm not understanding how a compressor works. Now, don't tell me all the numbers and everything else. I want to see. He goes, well, think of it this way. It's like a tent in a carnival. If you have a trampoline, and you go up and down, you hit the ceiling, it doesn't stop it. It'll stop it, but it gives a little bit of flex and comes back down. It kind of limits the sound. As soon as he said that, I went, got it. And then I could put the numbers with it and everything else. That's exactly what Jesus is doing. He's saying heaven is like, and then gives us this earthly physical thing to help us see, okay, I see what's happening. I see the comparison here. That's a similitude. Did I say it right? Okay. Third point, it always refers to that which is real. See, that's the difference between a fable and a parable. It's not referring to imagery. It's making up these, like the big bad wolf, for example. That's a fable. Well, there's no such thing as a big bad wolf that talks to Little Red Riding Hood or anything like that. That's imagery. Whereas in this case, he uses real object facts and experiences associated with human life. Never transgresses the limits of probability, and so it always stays within what is probable, what we can identify with and what we can focus on. And Jesus told stories that were true to life to make life more clear to truth. He's trying to help us understand the truth, and so he tells us these stories that we can identify with so that life becomes more clear, and then we can understand truth. That's the purpose of a parable. Now, they also have a universal appeal. They allude to familiar aspects of agriculture, domestic and family life, trees and fruit, business, society, weather, and there's a whole reason behind that. And we'll get into that more in just a second. There are certain rules that are used in, if you will, there's no such thing as these rules, but you see this pattern, I guess would be a better word, in these parables. That is, it always employs drama and discernible scenes. It always presented concisely with minimal characters. See, that's the other thing, too. It doesn't take much. It's very concise, minimal characters, and gets the point across. Only one plot is developed. The stress or the main point comes at the end. And the subject matter is taken from everyday experiences. And so these are some of the things that we need to understand when we're talking about how important it is to understand parables. So, for example, you have a fable. You think some of the famous fables that we have. Aesop is a Greek writer. It's debatable whether or not he existed or not, but this was 500 years before Jesus. And that's where we get some of these stories like the tortoise and the hare and things like that, which are great stories, and they have a moral to them, but they don't teach spiritual things. The boy who cried wolf and things like that. Those are morals, whereas Jesus is focusing more on spiritual things. And he uses things that we can identify with, that are easy to identify with, that have a familiarity to us, that causes connection. We do that also in our own conversation. Think about it. When we meet somebody for the first time, what do? Well, hey, John, how are you? I'm Troy. Nice to meet you. Where are you? What's the first question? Where are you from? And what do they usually say? Well, I'm from wherever. They'll say, I'm from Spokane, Washington. What do we typically do? Oh, I've been to Spokane, or oh, I've got an aunt that lives there, or oh, what a beautiful city. What are we doing? We're immediately making a connection. We're doing something that identifies. Now, what did we just do? We had a place. We have a place in common, and we do that all the time. Or, that's whenever you get that awkward moment, like somebody says, well, I'm from Bug Scuffle, Texas. Don't know where that is, never been there, don't know anything about that place. Moving on to the next subject, right? We always try to find that common ground. Like 2A, right? And so this is exactly what Jesus is doing. He's giving us things that we can identify with. What happens whenever he talks about these things, especially, don't forget now, talking about the audience that he's talking to, they're able to identify with. And he says sheep. There's going to be people who are tending to sheep, and they're going to know all about sheep. When he talks about the vineyard, there's going to be people who identify with that, or who may deal with that in their daily lives. And so that's what Jesus is helping us to understand. And it's interesting that 2,000 years later, even though he uses those agricultural, domestic type things, they still relate to us on an intimate, personal level. And that's the whole point, which brings us to the purpose. All right, so the purpose of parables. We have our first clue as to what the purpose is. If you'll look with me in Matthew chapter 13. Matthew chapter 13 and verse 34. This gives us one of the first purposes, the reason why Jesus speaks to them in parables. Chapter 13 of Matthew, verse 34. He says, all these things Jesus spoke to the multitude in parables. And without a parable, he did not speak to them. Listen to the words. That it might be fulfilled. Jesus is fulfilling prophecy. What prophecy? As spoken by the prophet, saying, this is Isaiah, saying, I will open my mouth in parables. I will utter things which have been kept secret from the foundation of the world. So there's one of the first reasons or purposes of the parables is that Jesus fulfills prophecy. Now the second one, if you'll go with me to Mark chapter 4. Mark chapter 4, look in verse 33. We have another reason or purpose for the parables. In verse 33 of Mark chapter 4, and with many such parables. Now, this is after Mark has already shown some of these parables that we have here. He says, and with many such parables, he spoke the word to them as they were able to hear it. But without a parable, he did not speak to them. And when they were alone, he explained all things to his disciples. And pay attention to those words, as they were able to hear it. See, this is one of the things that we're going to use and we're going to identify is that it's for revealing and concealing. And we get into that more specifically. If you'll go back with me now to Matthew chapter 13. You bet. Mm-hmm. That's a great question. Why did he have to explain it to the disciples if they should have understood it from the beginning? I think the answer would lie in using the Bible to answer your question in Acts chapter 1, verse 6. In Acts chapter 1, verse 6, the disciples said to Jesus, this is after he's already risen from the dead. He's been back from the dead. He's about to go back to heaven. And then his disciples said, Lord, are you now going to establish your kingdom? After all that, they still didn't understand. So apparently, Lord, there was still something in their hearts and minds that wasn't quite clicking. And none of it clicked until when? The next chapter, chapter 2, whenever the Holy Spirit comes. And then, at that point, the apostles could then write down these things. So that's what we have, a lot of this here, are Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Paul, and others, and Peter, who give their commentary, help explain things to us. And so that may be it. And we also see this, by the way, while we got that point there, just because the Holy Spirit comes in Acts chapter 2, they didn't all of a sudden have all knowledge of everything. You remember what happened in Acts chapter 10? Peter had to learn a lesson. Remember, he still didn't know that the Gentiles were included in this, and it wasn't until he walked into Cornelius' house that he says, I now understand that God is not keeping this only to the Jews, that he's no respecter of persons. You understand what I'm saying? The point being is there's still that level of choice and human spiritual growth. Lisa? What a great point, Lisa. That's very good. That's exactly right. Because we're all growing. Everybody in this room. There are some people in this room who have been Christians. Please, I'm not trying to disparage anybody. I'm just trying to show an illustration. There's some people, let's put it this way, in the church, who've been Christians for many, many years that are still not as much on a spiritual level, a spiritual maturity, as somebody who's been a Christian for just a couple, 3, 4 years. It happens. We all have different ways of learning things. I mean, look how thick Peter was. Was Peter kind of fluctuating? Yes. And then look at Paul. You know, Paul obviously had deep thought. All right, take just a couple more comments, and we got to get back on track here. Yes.
I think Peter knew that the Gentiles were included because he was ignoring the Gentiles when he was with the Jews.
This is true, but that was later. That was after Acts chapter 10. Yes, sir? Because Paul, yeah.
Paul talked to him?
Yeah, Paul, that was afterwards. So.
The vision he had in Acts 10, he doubted the vision.
Yeah, he even doubted the vision.
He said he saw these things, but he still had doubt.
I've never put anything unclean in my mouth, Lord. Why would I do that now? All right, let's get back to this. The purpose of the parables, too, if you look in Matthew chapter 13 with me here, in verse number 11 through 17, I want you to notice something. They said, why do you speak to them in parables? Backing up in verse 10. And then he goes through and he answers and explains it to them. You come all the way down to verse 17 of 16. And blessed are your eyes, for they see, and your ears, for they hear. For surely I say to you that many prophets and righteous men desire to see what you see and did not see it, and to hear what you hear and did not hear it. All right, he also says in here, the other thing he says in here, the mysteries of heaven, it was given for you, verse 12, abundance, but for some of them who don't hear it. Look in verse 13. Therefore I speak to them in parables, because seeing they do not see, and hearing they do not hear, nor do they understand. So the point of the parables, you'll see right here, is two functions. To reveal, while at the same time concealing. It's to teach part of the crowd while preventing other part of the crowd from understanding. What it did is it revealed truth to responsive hearers, but it concealed it to those who shut up their hearts. It served as a vehicle through which a person might demonstrate his heart's true intentions. Because, as I mentioned, this gets down into, you start to identify with these things and you realize, hey, this is my life. I deal with these things. And all of a sudden, your true intentions of your heart start to come out. Those who resisted Christ's authority, well, they refused to grasp. Now, we understand this. We do this still today. Think of the phrase, love is blind. You know, I had a personal experience just recently with this. You know what it is when you say love is blind? You think you're telling them something. Listen, you need to watch out for this, or you need to be this, or whatever it is. And what do? Oh, it'll be okay. They love me. And they're completely blind of what you're trying to tell them. Then what happens? Later down the road, when they're looking back, if something does happen bad or good, they look back and go, no, you were right or you were wrong. Right? Because then they've got eyes to see back. Hindsight is always 20/20. In this case, Jesus is saying those who want to see, who are seeking truth, who want to know the truth, they're going to hear these things crystal clear. Those who are resisting me, which would be who? The Pharisees, the Sadducees, they're not listening. They're listening, trying to... Have you ever done that? Have you ever noticed how when you're angry with somebody, that everything they say, everything they do has a whole different meaning? Whole different meaning. I'll never forget, you see it on TV, you see it in real life, when people go, well, that was just a slap in the face. Like, what? I wasn't even talking about you. That's a phrase that happens a lot of times. So that's what's happening here with parables. It was to reveal and to conceal. And also, in Matthew 13, 11 through 17, that right there we just read, those who really don't want it, who really want it, would gain access to the truth. And so this is how they function. You have a point of reference, or details that the hearer identifies with in such a fashion that they see themselves in the story. So if you start talking about something, if for example, Jesus starts talking about a lawyer went to trial, immediately Oscar's going to go, well, I know what that's all about. I've been there. I can relate to this, right? Immediately, Oscar's been brought right into the story, and Jesus has already went right to his heart. And then what happens is once the hearer is drawn into it intimately, then he becomes vulnerable to the point of the parable. So if he says a lawyer went to trial, and at that trial he discovered that he had forgotten all of his case notes and everything else. And so he panicked. And Oscar's thinking, been there, done that. I'm making this up, obviously. I'm not Jesus. I'm not a parable speaker. All right? But the point is Oscar can relate to that, and he'll say, I should never forget my case notes. Always make sure I have everything with me. All right? Whatever that is. So they become vulnerable to the point that Jesus makes, and then the message becomes more memorable. I mean, you think about it. What's something that stands out when Jesus uses, it's a parable but part of a metaphor, when he talks about first get the beam out of your eye before you go looking at the speck in someone else's eye. That's easy to remember. What about the lost sheep? What about the sower? We can remember those just like we remember songs. That's the point of a parable. You know, how many of you can think of some parables and go, yeah, you can pretty well relay the story of the parable? On the other hand, how many of you can tell me all the different things that Jesus said on the Sermon on the Mount? You see the difference? A parable is like a song. You remember it. Whereas the preaching and things that Jesus did, like the Sermon on the Mount, yes, there's some memorable things in there, but it's just general conversation. We don't remember that quite as in detail as we do these other things. And so the last thing in regards to parables, when it comes to interpreting parables, you need to always look at who the target audience is. So when you're looking at a parable, some of the parables we have, Jesus explains them. Like the parable of the sower right here. The disciples say, Jesus, what was that all about? He explains it. He says, okay, the sower is the Word of God. The seed is the Word of God. And this is what the hard soil is. This is what the thorns are. And he explains it. And he does that three different times with the wheat and the tares and stuff like that. So he explains it. We can use those to help us understand, okay, when there's not an explanation, at least we see the similarities or how we can go and interpret it in the way that Jesus intended for us to understand it. And so basically we need to look at the target audience, identify the points of reference. Who's he talking to? What's it about? Like this Jewish lawyer, a Pharisee? Is he talking to the disciples? And then what specifically is he trying to accomplish? Is he trying to teach about the kingdom? Is he trying to condemn or exhort? Is he trying to just look at the context to help you with some of those clues? And then finally look at some of the parallel accounts. If you look, for example, over in Mark, if you're reading Matthew, you look in Mark or Luke, there may be a parallel account that gives a little bit more information contextually. And then consider what is the lesson, where is the lesson, and then many of the parables, as I mentioned, have an explanation. And so I hope that this has helped you this morning as we get ready to start talking about the parables. Now, we will come back to this class in a month and a half, about a month and a half, when Scott finishes up his study on missions, and he and Rebecca are going to be transitioning into their work in Italy. And then I'll start back up with this class of the life of Christ, and we will start looking at these parables. And I hope and we'll review some of this. I hope this will help you, and as we study those, to have it a little bit closer to your heart and help you grow spiritually. Any last questions or comments before we dismiss? Yes?
How much can we rely on the underlying earthly point as being true when we look at these parables?
I would venture to say a very large amount. I don't know if I'd say 100%, but I mean, the underlying thing that he uses is always a real earthly thing. He doesn't use, fake things. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question? And because if he didn't, then it turns into more of a fable than it does a parable. Any other questions, comments? All right, we're going to prepare for our time of worship.